Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we are going to have a look at the book The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life by Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, published in 1859. Topics: evolution, natural selection. In this first edition, state with species was spelled as species on page 20, line 11. Printers Colophon, page 4 and 502, London, printed by W. Clowes and Sons, Stamford Street and Channing. So the question I'm asking here is, because this is what I've also read, but it could be creationist twist on it to demote it. Yeah. But here it states in the title, the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. So to me that hints that, okay, if it's a preservation of favoured races, okay, favoured or favourite or chosen races, a certain race in the struggle for life. Okay. So that could mean that he had racist undertones. We'll find that out. So what I did was I went online, googled it to see what people are saying, okay, about that. And then the Creation Studies Institute, they're saying that Darwin's theory is racist. The Creation Studies, I guess that's probably a religious faction, so it could be their bias, their prejudice, whatever, try to demote it because it's Darwin's theory. And that all men came from apes and all this sort of stuff. Okay, yeah, I think it's a religious faction because they've got a banner here of scripture. They're saying Darwin's theory is racist. If we want to discover the roots of racism in the 21st century, we need to look no further than Darwin's 1859 The Origin of Species. The original title for this book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, which we just read. This title remained until the 6th edition, when in the 1872 printing it was changed to its present form. What's that? The Origin of Species. Today, many popular movements like Black Lives Matter, which began in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, have rallied around cases of alleged police brutality against people of colour. Because many in our society make the mistake of rushing to judgment before all the facts are known, this group and others have been guilty of lumping legitimate cases of police brutality together with cases of unjustifiable violence by the police against minorities. The question we should be asking is, how can we rid ourselves of racism? If the people are failing to identify racism's root causes, if we are going to identify the basis reasons for racism, we will need to define the term. The Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary gives the full definition of racism as follows. 1. A belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. What are they saying? That certain traits and capacities, the way people act, they respond, proves that they're of a lower race, a lower species. They're nothing more but animals coming from a supremacist point of view, or supremacist group's point of view, and that their race is superior because of that. Racial prejudice or discrimination. The Merriam-Webster student definition of racism is belief that certain races of people are by birth and nature superior to others. Okay. Discrimination or hatred based on race or colour. Well, yeah. With these definitions in mind, we can conclude that racism is antithetical to the Bible, to the biblical model. The Bible teaches that every human being is created in the image of God, Genesis 1:27, and are therefore worthy of respect. God's word clearly opposes discrimination based upon race or gender, noting that the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob is impartial with regard to the entire human race. Matthew 5:45, Acts 10:34-35. The marital covenant or gender, Ephesians 5:21, even with regard to ethnicity, oh my gosh, ethnicity, Romans 10:12. If the testimony of the Holy Scriptures leaves no room for bigotry, racial or otherwise, we should take a long hard look at the predominant worldview that forms the basis for the indoctrination of students. It is indoctrination and not education, because only one version of the truth is taught, the theory of evolution. It is presented to students as a proven scientific fact. It's a scientific theory which is regarded as fact. Go look at the definition of it. You are not allowed to offer any criticism or alternative explanation, none. This is not education. We do not teach our students to think critically, and with regard to evolutionary teaching, we do not allow them to think for themselves at all. They say they'll simply share with you a few quotes from some of the leading voices in the world of 20th century evolutionary thought. Make no mistakes about this, many of the scientists that they're quoting here were avowed Marxists. According to quotes from within their own ranks, many were candid about wanting to produce a Marxian-inspired evolutionary biology. In his book, The Origin of Species Revisited, Wendell R. Bird, 1991, noted outspoken atheist Michael Ruse, referring to Gold, Lewontin and Oparin, noting that Oparin was quite open to a subscription to Marxist-Leninist philosophy of nature and consciously applied it to his work on the appearance of new life. Haldane and Bernal were also Marxists, according to Ruse, the late Stephen J. Gold was also a Marxist who wrote that racism was also heavily supported by evolutionists as a logical outgrowth of their Darwinism. Here are some of the quotes attributed to Stephen J. Gold. Biological arguments based on innate inferiority spread rapidly after evolutionary theory permitted a literal equation of modern lower races with ancestral states of higher forms. Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The litany is familiar, cold, dispassionate, objective. Modern science shows us that races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. At this point, I hasten to add that I am not selecting the crackpot statements of a bygone age. I am quoting the major works of recognized leaders. Today, our country is being destroyed from within by the unseen enemy who seeks to divide and conquer all of humanity with his fear-based lies. John 8:44. He inspires race baiters and those they influence. Most of them are woefully ignorant of the root causes of the racism, so they passionately decry it. This loathsome creature infects and corrupts the sciences with the false belief system of goo to you evolution. While Darwin's theory masquerades as scientific fact, racism continues to dominate our society. Some real, some feigned, but always rooted in the godless worldview called Darwin's theory of evolution. Do not be deceived. Darwin's theory is racist. When Darwin is properly understood, it leads to the justification for believing that certain races of people are by birth and nature superior to others, and that is the definition of racism. Submitted by Stephen Rowett, PhD. That's his point of view, his perception, perspective, and his understanding. It's one man's view. Creation Studies, Evolution and Racism, Commonwealth Magazine. Did Darwin promote racism? Answers in Genesis. Okay, this is all religious perspective. need to try and find one that isn't religious related or religion related. One of the most interesting facts that this person found in Darwin's Origin of Species is that the lines between species are blurry, both on a timeline and at any other given time. So when he read about social Darwinism, he wondered if Darwin thought it was more of an issue of advanced adapted civilization versus primitive, less evolved savagery than that of race species A versus race species B. What's the origin of the species and races book? Yahoo Answers. This is coming from just everyday people. The title is Origin of Species, and in Darwin's time the term race didn't mean what it means today. Darwin was referring to what we might call varieties of individuals within a given species, any species, not just human. Also the book didn't deal with human evolution. He wrote Descent of Man on that topic a few years later. Published in 1871, 12 years after on the Origin of Species, and the most serious consequences led to racism, eugenics, forced sterilization, and euthanasia of unfit people. Is there more here on it? This might be from coloured people. Stephen Crowder, David Barton and Tim discussed the racism of Charles Darwin in the Black History segment for Independence Day 2020, including the original complete title of The Origin of Species, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, and how that racism inspired progressive leftist icon, wasn't the president, Woodrow Wilson, etc. Was Darwin a racist? And does evolution promote racism? A claim often asserted by some is that not only does evolution endorse and promote racism, but also that Charles Darwin himself was a racist and openly labelled native Africans and Australians as a savage subspecies. In fact, some have even attempted to incarnate this belief from the law. It's another religious faction saying it's racist. Darwin, the father of modern racism. Okay, here's somebody saying something. A Free Republic. In his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, Darwin put forth the idea that all life came from a single common ancestor and changed without design, goal or purpose. Our brain and morality developed as such, and humans are merely another animal, as he put forth in Descent of Man. It doesn't look like he's being racist there. Another creation website, I guess. He says he's also familiar with the charges of racism levelled at Darwin, almost invariably by Christian creationists. They usually quote from the Descent of Man, and he's examined those passages from himself. Unlike the Origin of Species, the Descent of Man is full of footnotes. They say you be the judge of it. Is he actually talking about a species, or is he talking about a certain race, as in Black African? Anything that's considered anything that's considered on a lower scale than a certain race, a superior race. Okay, was Darwin racist? Published 17 October 2009, it's quite old. Your article begins well enough but quickly degenerates into God-bothering claptrap. What a shame for anyone concerned with the truth. Darwin got it wrong about the Fuegians, but he was never a racist, and he would have heartily concurred with Snow's view that the condition was due to their circumstances. He sympathised greatly with those harsh circumstances. You have cherry-picked your quotes because of your typical creationist loathing of the arch enemy, Darwin, as the Bible as a historical record. It isn't. It's mythology from start to finish, mountains upon mountains of archaeological empirical data have shown the Bible to be as unreliable a document as ever being written from a historical perspective, but of course you are blind to all that. Go away and lie no more. Okay, that'll be sounds like someone's quite peeved by the article, so maybe they might be an atheist, or they're just simply a Charles Darwin fan, right? Okay, dear Stuart, thanks for your feedback. You won't be surprised to hear that we respectfully disagree with you. Have you ever read The Descent of Man by Darwin? You could hardly deny his racism. I'm afraid if you had, that does not mean that you are wrong concerning his general sympathy for the underdog. He was also an abolitionist. If you get the chance to see a Darwin documentary that has been playing at Australian cinemas or via the DVD version, you will see, among other things, interviews with leading Darwin historians. One of them, very anti-creationist, nevertheless makes some very strong statements on the race issue. See also his extended interview on the issues on the DVD. There's a DVD there, I guess. I don't know, maybe that's something else. But Genesis. Okay. What's this? The real issue is not what sort of person Darwin was or was not, but it has to do with the validity of and evidence for the notion of microbe to man evolution. Okay, he says here, so in short, we think you are poorly informed, and also that we do not see Darwin as an object to be demonised. The doco treats him with respect and fairness, that as even many anti-creationists have acknowledged. Of course, the real issue is not what sort of person Darwin was or was not, but has to do with the validity of and the evidence for the notion of microbe to man evolution. Regarding the Bible and archaeological data, I'm surprised that you would think that. If you search our site, you will find a number of articles on the subject. But then, what one wants to believe definitely influences one's interpretation of data, and archaeologists are not immune to that, particularly when it comes to assigned dates and so forth. Okay. But our correspondent Stuart H said this to rejoinder. He says he's read Darwin's Origin of Species and currently reading his Voyage of the Beagle, hence his interest in Darwin and the Fuegians. Goes on about his cannibalism. He spotted cannibalism in that region. Okay, anything here? I'm also familiar with the charges of racism levelled at Darwin, almost invariably by Christian creationists. They usually quote from The Descent of Man, and I've examined those passages for myself. Unlike the Origin of Species, The Descent of Man is full of footnotes and references to contemporary and ancient thinkers. Virtually every racist observation made by Darwin in this work is a gloss on other scientists' racist observations. Darwin tended to call the indigenous inhabitants of the regions he visited savages, particularly when discussing them in a general way. So did every other white writer of his time, no matter how scientific. Darwin believed that black-skinned people were inferior to white-skinned people, though probably not naturally so. So did 99.999% of his compatriots at the time. This is not an exaggeration, it's an uncontroversial fact. As you should know, in Australia it was the mainstream view, even 50 years after Darwin's death, that our Aborigines were morally and intellectually inferior to white people, and that they should be encouraged to die out. If Darwin was racist, so was the whole of Western civilized society, an obvious fact that you people seem reluctant to point to. Darwin was a creature of his time. Aristotle thought slaves were subhuman. Immanuel Kant thought women had infantile, untrainable minds. Not even the greatest genius can transcend the prejudices of his or her age. We point out correctly that Darwin's personal views have little to do with the validity of the theology of natural selection, the most successful and productive theory in the history of biology. The fact remains, though, that many of your fellow Christians seem determined to personally denigrate Darwin clearly, in the hope that this will somehow weaken his credentials as a theorist. It's also a depressing fact that Christian propaganda groups such as yours have manipulated your way to the top of the search list, thus giving your extremist views a far greater prominence than your numbers merit. I'll continue to try to do my bit to redress the balance, Stuart H. To which Carl further replied, I suppose depending on where people are coming from, it will make a big difference to the gloss they put on things, but mostly if it's an unconscious thing. But truth matters at the end of the day. Certainly society was more racist back then than it is now, but there's a strong case for Darwin's theory anticipating substantial biological differences between the races, hence the comments by Dr. Peter Bowler on the Darwin film to which I earlier referred. Here is the actual transcript. Some of this was not used in the movie itself. N.B. Bowler is a leading Darwin historian and no friend of creationists. Okay, Peter Bowler at this part in the video. They hope that they will be able to educate the various races of mankind in the arts of civilization, but there was always this nagging problem of, is it going to be possible? And one thing that's characteristic of the general direction of Europeans' thought during the 19th century is there were increasingly harder line taken on that which we see reflected in Darwin himself. Yet by the time he writes The Descent of Man in 1871, it's pretty clear that he, by that time, shares the growing suspicions or conviction of many Europeans. The non-white races simply do not have the capacity to be elevated properly into civilized human beings that they are mentally and morally at a more limited level. In a sense, they are stuck at an early stage in the biological evolution of the human species. So their way of life may offer us a fossilized relic of what our ancestors lived like in the distant prehistoric past, but now Darwin and many of his contemporaries are beginning to realize that what they needed to claim that they are biologically relics of the past. They are in fact equivalent to earlier stages in the ascent from the apes who have been preserved in isolated locations, preserved with those earlier levels of mental and moral development. As leading evolutionists, the late Professor S.J. Gould of Harvard pointed out, though scientific justifications for racism were common for Darwin, they increased by orders of magnitude following the publication of his book in 1859. We have in the past also cited secular sources for the fact that the treatment of Australian Aborigines took a nosedive following the publication of the book. See e.g. The Scars of a Nation and A Sorry Day with an Unlikely Twist. This makes perfect sense, as does the link between Darwinism as strong inspiration for Hitler's views, confirmed in spades recently by academics such as Professor Weikart. Darwinism inspired eugenics was extremely common in the US. Darwinism inspired eugenics was extremely common in the US prior to World War II. See America's evolutionists, Hitler's inspiration. It's likely that it's the world's discovery of the horrors of the Holocaust which caused racism to become unpopular. If you doubt any of the above, the references are there on their website in the Q&A section. Of course, as indicated before, if evolution were the correct explanation for all of life's diversity and brilliant designs, a philosophical necessity for a non-theist, then it would merely be unfortunate that it happened to inspire racism, Holocaust, etc. The bad fruits of a belief do not affect whether it's true or not, but it makes it even more tragic and unfortunate when well-meaning but misguided churchians seek to encourage their fellows to embrace this belief system uncritically. Regards, Carl. Related articles, references. Okay, see, you have to weigh up the cons and the pros yourself. Read his books, and come to your own conclusions. Okay, let's have a quick look. If you'll let us. Okay, it's this sentence here that set them all off. Preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. So what does favoured mean is that's like favourite, particularly like a certain one liked. Doesn't it mean that if you define it? Races, what's that? Is that a selection of people, right? Okay. Nothing to do with animals, plants. I don't think so. Okay, here's content. Goes on for a few more pages of content. A lot of chapters. Okay, introduction. When he was on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist. Goes on about Wallace, who it's claimed he plagiarised his works from and claimed them as his own from his friend that was doing this similar sort of thing called Wallace. Again, go do your research on that, don't take my word for it. And there's lots more on this guy's book, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. I'll leave the link below so you can go have a look at it, read it yourself if you want to do so. If you like this, then subscribe to our channel. Please subscribe to our channel. Give us a like. Add your comments in the comment section, and then go tell your friends. Wow, read this book, Origin of Species, because it may have evidence that Charles Darwin was a racist.